That's a lot more than I got the last time I stood at this podium, which was about 5 days ago. One person went. So I could only say thank you for the thunderous applause, because what else can you do in the face of such complete disregard? Anyway, thank you. In case you're... It wasn't even deliberate or craven, and yet I really appreciate it. So, anyway, in case you're not aware, I'm Charlie. You're wondering, who is this guy up here? I'm Charlie Kyle. I'm the principal of Innis College. Welcome, everyone, to what I'm sure is going to be a wonderful evening. Before we get any further, let me read the land acknowledgement. We wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work and celebrate on this land. And I've been trying, first of all, I was away for the last year, but I've been trying over the last period of time to sort of append to this reading, which can become rote, admittedly, some reflection, not an attenuated one, and today I'm thinking we are aiming towards truth and reconciliation, and some of the Indigenous people I've talked to have said, you can't leapfrog over the truth to get to the reconciliation. So I think that's what I would leave people to think about, is to start confronting some of the truths that necessarily have to precede the process of reconciliation. I'm now going to be passing the baton over, but I just want to say that just between the speaker and the moderator, we have enough journalistic firepower here to blow up this building. So I'm really happy that we have this power duo to launch this year's iteration of the Harold Innis Lecture. But I will simply say, in way of introducing the next person who's going to come up and speak and introduce our speakers, that I won't say none of this would happen, because we have a great team of event planners and executors, if that's the right term. But every year, the person I'm about to introduce, who is the chair of the Harold Innis Foundation, engages in the pretense that the rest of us actually have something meaningful to contribute to the process of choosing the best speaker possible for the year in question. And the reason this person can do that with such assurance is because she's one of the few people I've met who knows every single person in Toronto. And I just feel that we're so blessed as a college to have this person in our orbit. She graces us, perpetually with her presence. And she's won many awards on her own, but she'll always have a special place in the college's heart, and that is Sita Ramkalawansing.
So is that louder for me than for Charlie? They're saying yes. Charlie mentioned about gracing Innis because he knows that my undergraduate college is a new college. I wasn't going to mention that tonight, but he brought it up. It is an honor to be a member of the Innis family and to be the chair of the Harold Innis Foundation. A number of our board members are here tonight, and I thank them for their ongoing participation. And it's not totally true that I get to decide, because there have been many occasions where some of my suggestions have been nixed by other people. So,
we always have another one.
Okay, all right. We have a peanut gallery here. I also want to express my appreciation to the amazing Innis College team, especially Shayla Anderson and Ben Westrade, and I don't know if they're in the room or doing other things. Okay. They're hiding back there. So Harold Innis. Harold Innis was born in 1894 and died in 1952. And he was described by his biographer as the greatest scholar of his generation. His most important scholarly works are in the areas of economic history and communications, and indeed one of the founding members of the Harold Innis Foundation was Marshall McLuhan. Taking the name of Harold Innis for the college reflects Harold Innis's spirit of innovation and creative inquiry. The foundation was established in 1969, and its founding meeting was held in February 1969 at Massey College. And in addition to this annual lecture, the Harold Innis Foundation has endowed in perpetuity a scholarship and prize program for Innis College students. The scholarship is awarded to students enrolled in an urban studies program, and the prize is awarded to Innis College students for outstanding voluntary activity that takes place off campus and outside the requirements of a course, and which represents the legacy of Harold Innis. I already mentioned that this lecture is given each fall, and we're in the process of trying to finalize next year's speakers. So around this time next year, we'll have the next lecture. I couldn't get a firm commitment from the person that we've approached and that I'm hoping will do it, but you'll know soon. Our past lecturers, recent lecturers, have included poet and novelist extraordinaire Dion Brand, former Mayor David Miller, journalist Andrew Coyne, historian Charlotte Gray, Innis grad Jesse Wente, and last year, Ayu Peter, an Inuit activist, gave the lecture. All of these speakers framed their presentations from the perspective of their own disciplines and experiences. So there's no set model. We find interesting people and they come and talk to us. So tonight's program will include the lecture by Robyn Doolittle, followed by a moderated discussion with Hamutal Dotan with a question and answer opportunity. And in keeping with Innis' tradition of student engagement, Kyle Newcomb, an Innis student, will offer thanks to our speaker and moderator. And Principal Kyle will close out the evening, so you get another chance to give him a thunderous applause. The registration page for tonight's lecture provides biographical information on both our lecturer and moderator, both of whom are outstanding award-winning journalists. In prior years in my life, I was a member of the Toronto Public Service, and I met both of these journalists as they hung out at Toronto City Hall. Robyn Doolittle is a member of the Globe and Mail's investigative team. Since joining the Globe in 2014, she has probed suspicious business contracts, political corruption, and Canada's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Her unfounded investigation explored the ways that Canadian police services handle sexual assault cases, and that work prompted a national overhaul of policy, training, and practices around sexual violence. She's the author of 2 books, Had It Coming, What's Fair in the Age of Me Too, which was shortlisted for the RBC Taylor Prize for Nonfiction, and Crazy Town, the Rob Ford story, both of which were national bestsellers. Many of you may remember her coverage of the Rob Ford years while she was a member of the Toronto Star Bureau at Toronto City Hall before she moved to the Globe and Mail. It is fitting that tonight's moderator, Hamutal Dotan, is an Innis grad and a Williams Southern Journalism Fellow at Massey College, where the foundation held its founding meeting. Hamutal has now been an editor and newsroom leader for 15 years, having spent time, in her own words, at rambunctious startups and in some of the most established newsrooms in the country. Most recently, she was the senior editor of The Walrus and an instructor in creative nonfiction here at U of T. While undertaking her Southern Fellowship at Massey, she will be studying psychology, sociology, and the history of reading, and generally having fun, I think. Kyle Newcomb, who will thank our speakers, is a third-year Innis College student focusing on finance and economics. He's president of the Innis Residence Council. He's student representative on the Innis College Council, contributor to the student newspaper. He's student ambassador for the Innis College Renewal and Expansion Program. And if that wasn't enough, Kyle is also a member of the board of the Harold Innis Foundation. So, we're all wearing black tonight. I didn't send out a memo. That was just, an accident. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Robyn Doolittle to the stage.
Charlie is totally right that Sita just commands all of us. I think you sent me an Instagram message. You're like, I need you to do this lecture. And I'm like, okay, when is it? Anytime, of course. I can't say no to you. I wouldn't even bother trying. So yeah, as mentioned, I am Robyn Doolittle, and I work at the Globe and Mail. I'm a member of the investigative team. This is my very first PowerPoint presentation that I've ever done. They don't even call them PowerPoints anymore. I don't know how this is going to go, but let's try to flip to a... Okay, it's working so far, so we'll see how this goes. I'm here to talk to you about Secret Canada, which is an investigation at the Globe into Canada's broken access to information system. It's a project that we've been working on for 2 years. At first, I just want to acknowledge that I am so filled with joy to see so many people come out to listen to a lecture about freedom of information, which, let's admit, is a very wonky policy topic. You don't want to clear a room, then don't talk about overuse of redactions or statutory time violations or lack of resources at appeals bodies. But let me tell you this, our governments, no matter who is in power, and our public institutions are counting on you to be completely bored by freedom of information. They want your eyes to glaze over. They want you to turn the page because there is nothing more terrifying to political leaders than an access to information system that works properly. And that is exactly why they have allowed it to become as dysfunctional as it is today. Obviously, I am pretty salty about this. I do want to say that I know the vast majority of politicians and public servants take on their jobs and in their careers for the right reasons. They genuinely want to help. They want to be a part of a wonderful and beautiful country. But I also think that through decades of bad practices, a troubling culture has taken hold in the Canadian system that views freedom of information requests as a burden and a nuisance that detracts from their regular, more important jobs. Politicians love the idea of government transparency until they are in government. And then it seems a lot less attractive. They're worried about embarrassing headlines that can distract from their goals. And they're worried about a nothing burger flippant comment in an email derailing important public policy initiatives that they're working on. And I do sympathize with this. I get it. There is a natural tension there. But too bad that is the job. And I do want to remind people, and this is what we've done throughout the series, that freedom of information laws are laws, and they exist for a reason. And just in case anyone's not familiar with this incredibly wonky policy issue, let me take a beat to explain freedom of information. Freedom of information legislation, which is sometimes called access to information laws or right to information laws, exist in jurisdictions across Canada and in countries around the world. They are a legal process by which regular people can access public records that have not otherwise been released. FOI legislation enshrines into law the principle that we as people, as taxpayers, as citizens, have a right to know what our public officials are doing, how our institutions are being run, and how our money is being spent. They are the foundation of democracy, and democracy is built on trust. If people don't trust their institutions, if they don't trust that their institutions are acting in their best interest, at some point, people may stop participating in them. These systems that shape our lives and our government, they're not really real. They're not necessarily a forever thing. We created them. We've agreed to be a part of them because we believe these institutions are acting in our best interest. And because we have that trust, we voluntarily pay our taxes. We apply for a building permit if we want to do a renovation in our bathroom. We line up at Service Ontario for hours to update our health card information. But what happens if that trust is lost? We are seeing in real time what can happen when that trust is lost. This is why freedom of information is not boring. It is the foundation of our democracy. It's our contract with the institutions that govern us. And what the Globes Project has found is that our governments and public institutions are trying really hard to test that trust. This is why the Globe created Secret Canada. And let me tell you about the project. In October 2021, it was actually almost 2 years ago to this day, my reporting partner, Tom Cardoso, who is an Innis grad. Is it something else?
Cinema studies, let's say that.
Okay. Sure, yeah, okay. Tom and I got to talking about freedom of information. Both of us had pitched projects to the Globe about FOI. We were sick of whining about redactions on Twitter. And if any of you follow journalists on Twitter, you'll be familiar with this. We love to moan about FOI on Twitter, partly because it's cathartic, but up until recently, it's felt like the only platform we had to really talk and raise these issues. Media institutions in general have been very reluctant to get into it about FOI in our actual news pages because, one, they think readers are bored by it, and maybe they are, and two, it seems like way too much inside baseball. But Tom and I were sick of shouting on Twitter. We wanted to know if we could do something about it. We're both members of the Globe and Mail's investigative team, and we've both taken on very large projects tackling complex systems in this country and how they don't work. So we said, let's sit down over a pint. And I did take a picture because I anticipated one day we are going to need to explain this. Could we turn our investigative muscle on the FOI system? Could we investigate why it is so hard to investigate anything in this country? And along with a really talented team at the Globe, including Mahima Singh, Karis Mills, Danielle Webb, Yang Sung, and Ming Wong, we set about crafting an investigation that could actually do something about this problem. We knew we couldn't just be journalists complaining, and we had to offer some sort of a solution along with the traditional news stories. And we knew we had two giant hurdles to overcome. One, many readers would not be familiar with freedom of information. We know this is a topic that not everybody thinks about every day. And two, it sounds like the most boring investigation of all time. We knew that to get people over the who cares hump, we had to really drill into the consequences of this wonky policy story. We had to explain why FOI is so important. And if you'll indulge me a moment, on a quick detour down memory lane, I would like to explain my own history with FOI and how I've used this tool throughout my career. I started my career as a reporter at the Toronto Star, as Sita mentioned. First, I was a general assignment reporter, and then I covered the police beat, and then I moved on to the municipal politics beat. I always used FOI. I got into the habit of filing one a week, and there's a real art to writing FOIs. They weren't always great, but sometimes they landed. And Some of my favorite stories from my city hall days were just basic FOI. One was about the TTC. At the time, the transit agency was very troubled, and there was going to be a big study of its customer service issues, and I filed an FOI for all complaints over a set period of time that riders had sent into the transit agency. And they were, one, just totally hilarious to read, and two, important. It gave us a real window into what was happening in the transit agency. And there was this one story that I will always remember of a person calling this streetcar driver a dragon lady, and she would yell at him every day. But anyway, it just stuck with me, and I think it really humanized the story for a lot of people and was also entertaining. And the other one was the Gardner Expressway, if you remember that. That was a story that came about. It made headlines after I found through FOI an engineering report that outside engineers said the Gardner Expressway was unsafe and was falling down. And it dominated the news cycle for weeks after that. Then along came Rob Ford when I was a municipal politics reporter, and this made me much more visible in my career. And it was during the Rob Ford era that I really got to understand the challenges with the FOI system in Canada in particular. The best examples are, especially when the story went international and I was having to talk with foreign reporters about this case, you'll recall the crack video. Maybe you remember that. That was 2013, I think. Maybe 2012, 2013. I had been working on that investigation for something like 2 years beforehand. And reporters from outside Canada were like, I don't understand. Why did this take so long to report? It's because of FOI that it took so long to report. In 2010, I had tips from my police sources that there were frequent domestic incidents happening at the mayor's home. So this is not just, oh, that's some gossip. This is a real public policy, public interest issue. The mayor of the city, who is in charge of the police budget, is having very frequent domestic calls at his home, and police are showing up and dealing with it. And we can't know about it. I filed an FOI for all the calls that were happening at the address, and they were all denied. And I remember talking to an American reporter about it years later who was just confused, I don't understand. That's not secret. There's police cars out front. Yeah, exactly. We were hearing about police picking up Rob Ford while driving, possibly drunk, and being driven home, and we couldn't get any paperwork on it. When I was writing my book on this years later, he was picked up for drunk driving in Florida many years before he was mayor. And I went to the police service, and they gave me the file, his drunk driving file. And I was able to see the actual incident, how it was written about, what his blood alcohol level was like, what his sobriety test was like. You might think that that's an overreach, because in Canada we are very skittish about privacy. But let me tell you, the fact that Canadian journalists can't access that type of information about people is allowing, I think, a lot of the scandals, I won't mention any right now, but is allowing a lot of the scandals that are happening in this country because we can't properly get at that. But the big kind of turning point for me with FOI was once I came to the Globe and was working on the investigative team, my investigation into the way that police handle sexual assault cases. And this was called Unfounded. And Sita mentioned this in my bio. So to go back to 2015, this was around the time that Gian Gomeshi was being arrested for sexual assault. And at the time, everyone was talking about, the system is rigged against sexual assault complainants. There's no chance he's going to get convicted. And I was really interested in this question. Is the system rigged against sexual assault complainants? I think that many people I know would say yes, but is it actually true? Was there a way I could quantify it? And long story short, I ended up focusing on this police statistic that I'd never heard of before, despite having been a police reporter, called Unfounded. Unfounded is a code that police use for statistical purposes on investigations. It means this crime did not occur. You come to me, you say you were raped. I've done an investigation. I have concluded you were not raped. It doesn't mean we don't have enough evidence to proceed. It doesn't mean the complainant backed out or we couldn't find the person. It means this is fake or baseless. That's unfounded. And it was like, oh, perfect. This is a great way to quantify if the system is rigged against sexual assault complainants. I will collect unfounded statistics from police services across the country. So I email StatsCan, our statistics agency, of course. Hey, can I have your unfounded stats, please? We don't collect unfounded stats. Why don't you collect unfounded stats? Well, we used to, but police services weren't using them correctly, so we just stopped. Okay? So they're like, you should just ask the police services. So I asked the police services. I started emailing the big ones. Can I have your unfounded stats? Because I had no idea what it would be. We don't release those. What? You don't release a crime statistic? I had to file hundreds of individual Freedom of Information requests with every single police service in the country, and there are more than 1,100 police jurisdictions in this country, to individually collect all of their unfounded stats. And what it showed is that on average, 1 in 5 sexual assault complaints were being dismissed as fake or baseless. So this is really important because, again, that's not the number that don't result in charges. That's 20% of cases chopped off the top as fake. And then we get into whether there's enough evidence to proceed. Okay? So I do want to mention that took more than a year to collect. Okay? My checkbook has never recovered from all of those $5 application fees I had to do. I emailed the FBI for their stats on unfounded, and they sent it back to me in about an hour. This is what it's like in Canada. We shouldn't even have to file FOIs for this basic stat, but that is repeated over and over and over again in my reporting. And unfounded, as mentioned, it landed at a time, I don't want to take full credit for it, and obviously the story really drove home because 54 complainants came forward to tell their stories, and they were very powerful, and coupled with the data was just absolutely, it was impossible to ignore, and it landed 8 months before Me Too, so the culture was very primed. But it had a profound impact across the country. Police services had to change their policies, practices, training. StatsCan started collecting unfounded rates again and started publishing them. And if you don't track it, you can't improve. And that was because of FOI. But the story for me that really inspired Secret Canada, that made me go, okay, this is time, I'm sick of this, was one I did in 2021 on the Champlain Towers, the condo that collapsed in Florida. You may remember this story. It was extremely tragic. Surfside, Florida, a condo fell in the middle of the night and crushed hundreds of people to death who were asleep in their beds. It was built by Canadians. So if you can imagine at the Globe and Mail, natural investigation, oh, a Canadian developers built a condo. Did they build any buildings here? Are those buildings going to fall down? Like pretty basic stuff. So we assembled a team and we get to work on it. The American leg of the investigation took a couple of days. The Canadian leg of the investigation took 4 months and thousands of dollars. Let me tell you why. In the United States, you can go to a website that is online and type in the name of a building and get all the developers. You can type in business information and see who is connected to various companies. You start building out your web, your reporting web, and then you start searching those names and pulling lawsuits, which are also public, and you can find all of that information. The town of Surfside, when the Champlain fell, posted within days all of the records that they had about the building, including the original permits from the 1970s, reports that had been compiled through the years on safety, emails between the property owner and management company and the city, just dozens and dozens and dozens of documents within days. Can you imagine that happening in Canada? It absolutely never would. This is how we did the Canadian investigation. I pulled up the Globe classified section from the 1960s and went day by day, reading line by line to see if I could see any of the names that I'd found in the American documents in our own newspaper. So you'll see on the right there, it says Canyon Towers. That's how I found their tower, because it has their name in it. And then once we had, it's like circled in red over there. or the law practice up here of one of the developers. And then once we had the classified information, I would send that to our researcher, librarian, Steph Chambers, who would then try to pull the corporate records from the Ontario archives. And we'd then get the property searches, because unlike in the United States, you can't go onto a database and see who'd owned properties before. You can't see, there's no way to comprehensively search unless you have a specific address. And by the way, every time we pulled one of those records, it cost somewhere between $27 and $40, which might not sound like a lot, but I'm pulling hundreds of records. Property records ran between $30 and $200 each. And again, the total bill was about $4,000. And while I'm here, I just want to take a quick side rant to note the Ontario government privatized a lot of its corporate record services. And today, if you want a corporate profile in this province, it costs $64.50. Which, again, when you're doing these big investigations, you are pulling dozens and dozens of these. Can you imagine a freelancer trying to do this? By contrast, the service fee in most other provinces is free to $10. So that isn't exactly freedom of information, but it's part of this same culture in Canada that treats transparency as an optional thing. And it's not. FOI is a fundamental right, and in fact, in many countries, it's a constitutional right. So let's talk a little bit about the history of FOI. Sweden's Freedom of the Press Act is widely considered the first piece of FOI legislation. It was signed in 1766. For the rest of the world, the FOI movement really began after the Second World War. This is when world leaders were sitting together and grappling with how it is that we came into a global conflict twice in a generation. They considered the role that Nazi propaganda had played in manipulating the German public and enabled Hitler's rise. The thinking was perhaps if people had had a better idea of what Hitler was doing and planning prior to the war, the Holocaust and the war, history may have been different. Obviously, this is a very extreme example, but the idea here was that forcing government transparency can be a powerful tool to maintain peace. And in fact, at the first United Nations General Assembly meeting in 1946, leaders adopted a resolution that declared freedom of information is a fundamental human right and is the touchstone of all of the freedoms to which the United Nations is consecrated. 20 years later, the US formalized this sentiment in an FOI law. And after the US Senate voted in the legislation, MP Barry Mather, a New Democrat from BC, proposed Canada adopt something similar. This was 1965. And it went nowhere. Canada and other countries hummed and hawed over FOI during that time and did many studies. The movement got a big boost with the Watergate scandal in the early 1970s. Nova Scotia was actually the first jurisdiction in Canada to pass FOI law in 1977. The federal government finally got on board in 1982, although at the last minute, Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau really upset his critics because he inserted an exemption for cabinet records. Still, Canada was one of the first 10 countries in the world to adopt FOI, making us a global leader. In the following decades, journalists and researchers used access to information laws to expose big stories. For example, in 1984, FOI exposed that hemophiliacs were being infected with HIV through contaminated blood, and the Canadian government continued to use that blood, knowing it was contaminated. It was an access request that revealed allegations that Canadian soldiers had abused Afghan detainees. It was an access request that kickstarted the sponsorship scandal. But our access laws have not been meaningfully updated since the 1980s. And today, the Centre for Law and Democracy, which is an international human rights organization based in Halifax, now ranks Canada's legislation 51st in the world. Among other democracies and allies, I cannot overstate how behind we are. So now Tom and I and the rest of the team had to go about showing why, the consequences of our bad system, and what to do about it. So this is the beginning of our reporting. We did something a little different than we would usually do. We put out a call in advance to announce that we were investigating access to information. We wanted to talk to people who lived and worked in the system, who filed FOIs regularly. We wanted to connect with real people because, again, we know that journalists are annoying and people don't like us. They don't want to hear journalists moaning about redactions. They wanted real people. We also knew, and this is a lesson that I had from Unfounded, that you can build those stories, those anecdotal, powerful people stories, on a foundation of data. So we needed to do an audit of FOI somehow in this country, which is not done, by the way, before the Globe did it. Others have in the past, but not at the scale that we have done. We filed FOIs with every department and ministry in the country, at the provincial level, territory, and at the federal government. In total, 253 departments and ministries. And we asked for copies of their internal tracking system. We wanted to know how long FOIs were taking to be processed, how often were requests being responded to with full access, partial access, denials. We wanted to know what exemptions were being used. And we asked for the request text of the FOI because the tracking systems often use a summary. And this was really important because, as we mentioned before, we were very conscious of the fact that we knew people were not going to be receptive to this investigation if it was just journalists moaning. Also, people have no appetite right now for bad news, which I get. So we wanted to build a solution into the project to start, because we were also very skeptical that government was actually going to do anything. And this is where we devised this idea. A big gap in the Canadian FOI system, which doesn't exist in other countries, is that no one knows what's already been released. In other countries, once a record has been vetted and released to a person, it is available online. You can request it, you know. In Canada, no one has any idea, even within their own department. So the same records are being vetted over and over and over again. You're interested in snapping turtles? We wanted to give you a place that you could go and type in snapping turtles and see if any public records have already been released on this topic. And because we were doing this audit and collecting all of this text, we now had the data to do it. And this was the beginning of our Secret Canada website, which I will tell you more about later. In our actual people stories, we talked to a developer who suddenly in a small town got in a beef with the local politicians, as happens in small towns, if any of you are from small towns. And suddenly his building permits started being denied all of a sudden. For buildings, he was building the same type of thing over and over again. Suddenly they were denied. Why? He files an FOI to figure it out. He's quoted $2,000 for a processing fee. He pays it and gets almost entirely blacked out paper and told that 3,500 pages are being withheld for no specific reason. We talked to an environmental group that was trying to investigate while the Alberta government was killing wild horses. And she was quoted $100,000 for the piece of paper, the report that the government was using to justify the horse culling. We interviewed a woman a doctor who faced career repercussions for criticizing the Ontario government's response to COVID. And through getting, he filed multiple complaints with the Appeals Commission. And through the evolution of that Appeals Commission, you can document where the hospital had been redacting information purely because it was embarrassing. We wrote about a case of a woman who filed a police complaint against her former husband, and then years later wanted to find out what had happened with the case. And I can say, having investigated sex assault, it's very common that sexual assault complainants or complainants in general are never told about what happens to their case. She was denied the file for privacy reasons, her own police file, her own police interview, because she mentioned her ex-husband's name, and that would violate his privacy. Thank you. So the series launched on June 9, 2023, after a year and a half of work, and we blew out the whole front page. We tried to make the case as best as possible about how governments are testing our trust. This is what we found. This is a pretty dense slide. You don't have to read it. Just get the vibe that it's a lot of work, okay? Our reporting showed that every day in this country, public bodies and governments at every level are breaking the law. Access units have been starved of resources and staff. Institutions cannot hit their statutory deadlines, which is usually 30 days. The law themselves are impractical, they're out of date for our modern world, and we also found it was very normal for public bodies to outright refuse records that judges and adjudicators have said unequivocally, this is public. For example, contracts, government contracts. Of course, government contracts are public, but they are constantly being denied. And in fact, Tom and I filed test FOIs just to test these precedents. I filed for 2 of them. I wanted the garbage contracts for the City of Windsor and the City of Halifax, and both denied my request. Our audit showed that only 21% of FOI requests were granted in full. 46% were granted with some redactions. But here's the other big number. Only 50% of FOIs were completed within the 30 days. Overall, 5% of requests took more than 6 months to complete. That might not sound like a lot, but again, compared to other countries, which sometimes process these things in days, this is humiliating. We wanted to better understand the extent to which institutions were breaking the law, which is hard to do, but we conducted an analysis of about 1,100 publicly available provincial and territorial appeals decisions from 2022. That review found that in cases where appellants had raised concerns about the overuse of redactions, adjudicators found that public institutions had wrongly withheld information 59% of the time. That real rate is much higher because when we were going through the files, public institutions almost always agreed to release some more information once they were challenged. It's also important to keep in mind that only a fraction of cases are ever actually appealed. Most people don't have the time or energy. I also want to say that it's very common for government bodies to hire very expensive Bay Street law firms to keep information from citizens, which was the case with the doctor who was trying to get information from his hospital. Instead of actually, saving lives like he's supposed to be doing, he's engaged in these ridiculous FOI fights. I know what I'm talking about is very high level. It's not feasible to study all of the many thousands of institutions that are subject to FOI in this country. We only looked at ministries and departments. But what you can see is that things varied a lot across the country. And moreover, I do want to note that departments and ministries are the most professionalized FOI units. They have the most resources, training, and scrutiny. So you can imagine what's happening in smaller public institutions. It's not only government that is subject to FOI, it's school boards, universities, crown corporations, municipality, police services. All of these, I should also mention, I forgot to say before, were included in our Secret Canada database. Speaking of which, this is secretcanada.com. And this is an unprecedented resource that is outside of the Globe's paywall that anyone can access. So we have more than 300,000 summaries for FOIs that were completed between around 2021 to 2022. It includes all government ministries and departments, as mentioned, but also these other institutions, such as police services, universities, crown corporations like hydro and telecoms, lottery and gaming. You would be surprised how many places are subject to FOI, and now any Canadian can go on here and look those up. So for example, you type in snapping turtle at the top, and this is an example of an FOI that mentions snapping turtle. We also then make it really easy for you to request the document. So FOIs typically cost about $5 to apply for, and then depending on how it goes getting the files, you have to pay additional money to access those records. But if you piggyback on a request that's already been completed like this, it's free. We also include resources on how to use the FOI system, and we included all the different laws and jurisdictions across the country because things vary a little bit here and there. Here's another example, how to file an appeal with an FOI. And we included a letter generator. So we will, if you don't know how to write an FOI letter, we will create it for you. This has been used more than 15,000 times since we launched it in June. And finally, this is a big part of the project, is the news tab. This is where we're going to put our niche moaning about the system. Because holding government to account, really the best medicine is shame, I think. We've also tried to make FOI fun and try to reach the youth. Because we know this is a boring topic, we started an Instagram account that only does niche FOI joke memes. We made tote bags, and by the way, they sold out 3 times. We had to stop selling them because we couldn't keep up with filling all the orders while doing journalism. And Tom and I did a lot of interviews talking about this topic to get people excited about it. So to wrap up, and I know I've gone way over my speech time, but we also looked at other countries and what's working elsewhere. And I want to highlight 3 really quickly. One thing that is really hurting our system is that Canada does not have a declassification system for public records. Most other democracies and our allies have this. So right now, in theory, records from the early 1800s are not accessible in Canada because they're classified, okay? In countries like the US and the UK and France and Australia, there's a time period. There's an understanding that information becomes less sensitive over time, and they will release it after, say, 20 or 30 or 50 years. We have nothing like that. In fact, when we put our call out for people who've interacted with the system, the most angry people were historians, and we do have a story on that very soon. Norway, another country. Norway has a website that lists an inventory of every public record. Like your shopping list, you can click on the ones you want, and you will get it in a couple of days. There is no FOI department in Norway. Public servants understand it's a part of their job. The last one I want to point to is Mexico. Mexico is one of the best FOI systems in the world. In Mexico, it's a constitutional right, and they have other really strong laws, and I'm going to read this because I want to make sure I'm saying it exactly. Article 70 of Mexico's General Transparency Law lists nearly 50 categories of records that must be made public, including the organizational structure of each public institution, the responsibilities of each public servant and their gross and net pay, contracts, agreements, permits, and licenses, bid process documents, and, quote, any other information that is useful or considered relevant based on, quote, frequently asked questions by the public. In Canada, some of that information isn't even available through the FOI process. Mexico also has a centralized system where you can request any record from this website. It is true that the current president is trying to make access more difficult in that country, but even with that, they are so far ahead of us, we should be extremely embarrassed. So as for us, we are not stopping anytime soon. The Globe is back in the field. We've sent out our second round of FOIs off to more than 500 public institutions this time, so we can update Secret Canada in 2024 with our new data. And we're going to keep the pressure on governments and institutions. And now I need you to do something for me, which is talk to people about this extremely boring, not boring topic. Spread the word, because we cannot let things continue as they are. Our actual democracy is at stake here. That's the end. Okay, I'm not horribly over. And nobody's asleep yet, so that's great.
Nope. Everyone looks all perky. So thank you for that really comprehensive and alarming guided tour. Of the many things that are alarming about what you've outlined is this culture of impunity. And it's striking because in Canada, we don't think of our government as being above the law. There are often consequences when government itself operates in defiance of the law. They have to comply with court orders. The Supreme Court can say, nope, this new legislation falls afoul of the Constitution, try again. And they do. So why isn't that happening here?
Thank you for focusing on that issue, because that is, an absolute huge one, is that FOI laws are just being straight up ignored, and there is very little we can do about it. I didn't get into this, but the province of Alberta denied to participate in our audit, which they can't do, by the way. Again, it's an FOI request, you have to respond. And it's kind of a long story, I won't get into it, but we ended up, raising the issues of what they were saying, and the Office of the Information Commissioner in Alberta has actually announced a systemic review of the entire government, that they're doing this, because it's not just us also, that the government has in general been trying to limit their obligations under FOI. But there's many instances in which a government is ordered to release a file after an appeal win, and they just ignore it. What do? I think we shame the hell out of them. That's kind of all I've got. I've got this platform, and that's what I'm doing. But there's many changes you can make, including fines. You can tie manager bonuses to their FOI performance. Because right now, I think managers and public servants, frankly, are incentivized to withhold information. If you think about it, it's a risk-averse culture. Nothing bad is going to happen to you if you don't release a record. So if you got something that's going to embarrass your boss, it's blacked out. Maybe they'll appeal it, maybe they won't. If they do appeal it, it'll take 2 years to get settled. And if you win, all that happens is you have to release the record that you were supposed to release initially.
So is there case law about this? Has it gotten to the Supreme Court? What is the highest level at which this has actually been adjudicated?
Well, I guess what to be adjudicated? Do you have to follow FOI? I mean, yes, when it goes all the way through to court, once it makes it to regular court, yes, those governments can be compelled to do stuff. One of the suggestions, the federal government just did a big review of its access to information legislation. They released their final report on it last week. The standing committee listed, I think, 38 recommendations for how to improve the system, and the government said, thank you, we are not going to do a single one of those. But we're going to look at it again in 2025. So that's great that we as taxpayers can pay for them to, once again review this and say it's important and not do anything. What was the question? No, so here's the thing. One thing that is interesting, there is some discussions in legal corners about whether our charter does protect FOI as a constitutional right. And on Secret Canada, I actually have an interview with Beverly McLaughlin where she doesn't outright say it, but she says, look, there's a very clear line between charter protection of freedom of expression and access to information, because you cannot, as a citizen, properly express yourself and participate in your democracy if you are not properly informed. So there is some push to find the right case to make that charter challenge. But for now, we are literally dealing with just screaming at them, I think. So start screaming at them.
There, that's all of your homework. So in addition to this culture of impunity, you also talk about this culture of resistance to change, resistance to transparency. And what's striking to me about that isn't just that we've fallen behind other countries that are comparable, it's that we used to be a leader in this. As you said, we were one of the first countries in the world to pass serious legislation. So what happened? Is it something in the water? Is it something in the national psyche? The challenges that you describe, governments are underfunded and they're understaffed, and there's technology and digitization to keep up with. Those aren't challenges that are unique to Canada. So what is the origin story of how we went from being a leader to falling this far behind?
Part of it is that we were among the first, right? So it took, as I said, the first time it was mentioned was in 1965. And we had all of those years fighting and doing research and studies. It was actually I think it was criminal law. It was actually lawyers who really fought for access to information in Canada. It wasn't journalists, which I find rather embarrassing. But it was lawyer groups that really pushed for it. And then you spend all your political capital and you get a law passed. And so now, how much are you going to spend to improve it when it's only going to hurt you? And that's kind of what happened, is that FOI laws were written in the 1980s, okay? Before anything like an email was in anyone's mind. This is what you hear from people in the system, that there are so many records now. That didn't used to be the case, okay? Like, we write everything. We write our every waking thought in an email. There's text messages. There's Slack channels. There's, all these different files that are all subject. And it takes, if someone files a request, I want all records related to snapping turtles. Like, how do you even begin to collect public records on that? This is where an inventory would be helpful. But so I think what's happened is, like, the law was written before the digital world existed. And then things started ticking along, and governments were facing repercussions for things that were being exposed through FOI. And then things got more complicated, and there were questions about, can you update it? And they're kind of going, well, why would I update it? It's only going to make my life harder. And I do have a very cynical view of it. I don't think it's more complicated than that. I think that governments don't want to make it easy because the public has not historically cared, I think. And so they're allowed, when there's so much, in fairness to them, there are so many fires. Like, where do you direct your efforts? So I think that is what's happened. But I do feel a little bit of a turning point right now. I mean, certainly people, I'm not like the entire country reads the Globe and Mail, but a certain subsection of the country reads the Globe and Mail, and they are talking about FOI now, and they happen to be people who I think are in the FOI world. And so I am optimistic that there could be some change on that front. A lot of the changes are not that difficult, I'd have to say. Some are very complicated, but yeah. And I do sympathize with politicians who would say, or political leaders who would say, look, like, we have all these great policy initiatives, and because one stupid comment in an email is going to distract from the whole thing and unravel this thing that's really going to help people. And, like, that's where they're, I think, coming from, not necessarily from a, like, totally sinister way, but I mean, I think it's a very misguided approach to governing.
So on the question of shouting, and shouting being the only thing that makes a difference, can you talk a little bit about Newfoundland and Muskrat Falls and how FOI has evolved there?
Yeah, my colleague Tom is the expert on Newfoundland and wrote a really excellent piece about it in the Globe that you can read. But the bottom line here is that Newfoundland is a jurisdiction that did make some improvements. And I think a big one is they made it so that you had to respond to FOIs within a certain amount of time, that they limited the extent to which you can extend and extend and extend, or delay and delay. And they also gave their appeals commission this kind of unique power. So on jurisdictions like Ontario and BC and Alberta have what's called order-making power. So the adjudicator can say, ye government, you must release the file. And in smaller jurisdictions, they don't really like this because it means that, although they want order-making power, it requires that these decisions are written in a really, like, legalese way, which slows the process down a lot, and why there's creating these huge backlogs. So in the smaller jurisdictions, what they do is kind of have a reverse onus, is they'll make a recommendation, no, you have to release the file, and if the government doesn't like it, they have to take it to court. So those, I kind of think, to me, are the high-level things with Newfoundland. But I mean, again, takeaway here is that Newfoundland saw a problem, and they tackled it, and it's better now.
So, but this is actually what interested me about that piece, is the reason that they saw a problem, it wasn't through conversations like this. They weren't sitting and, meditating on the politics and philosophy of governance. Muskrat Falls happened. And it was so controversial, and there started to be a sense in the public, this real discomfort with cost overruns and mismanagement, that there started to be some political pressure and some real momentum around releasing more information. And the thing that I really love about that situation is the government knew that it was going to lose power in the next election. And so then they knew that they were going to be in opposition, and it was going to be politically helpful to them to have greater FOI powers, and that's how the legislation got changed. And so if we look at that, does it actually take something like that? Because fundamentally, you have all these ideas about what could improve the system, these measures, attaching bonuses to people, for people to expedite these things, all of these ideas. but it requires political will. Do we need a massive public scandal and an election cycle to line up with it in order to get the political momentum?
Sure, I think you always, again, going back to that, what, as a politician, what's in it for me to spend this political capital to make this change? It's gonna make my job harder. So that's a case of, you know, you're setting yourself up to be in opposition and to use it as a power wield that way. I mean, you see this in Nova Scotia, in many countries, that the opposition will promise, when I'm elected, I will do it, and then they kind of don't. So yes, I think you could have a giant scandal that would galvanize the country, but I don't know, the alchemy of a really small place like Newfoundland, where something like that can touch literally everyone, what would a comparative thing be for the rest of us? I mean, what was really interesting to me, no matter where you land on COVID vaccines, as someone who read, because we had to read all of those hundreds of thousands of lines that went on the Globe's website, many are related to people trying to find out from their governments about COVID vaccine policies. And you can read in the responses how disdainful, I think, in many cases, government is having to respond to them. On one hand, yeah, you're annoyed, you work in public health, you believe in this, you have all the science. On the other hand, someone is interested in government policy, like, make it easy for them, right? So I think that actually, COVID was a huge thing that people should realize, that you need to make this information transparent. And I do think, actually, to government's credit, they did do a lot of, especially health agencies and bodies started proactively publishing data that they hadn't before. But I honestly, I don't really have an answer other than I think that people need to say this is a priority. I do think we are getting there. There was an insurrection in the US. Like, this is, and we love US culture. It's permeating here all the time. So yeah, at some point there will be, because it's not a partisan issue, right? Like, you can see both sides getting on this. In fact, there's quite a populist bent to it that I keep waiting for people to pick up on.
All right, I don't want to take up all of the time that we have for questions. So there are two lovely volunteers with mics at the back of each aisle. If you have a question, just raise your hand and they will come to you so that you can ask it. You gotta practice.
Pressure.
There we go. There we go.
Hi, that was great, Robyn. Thank you. That had my attention and everyone else's, I think. I think I saw on one of the slides a little asterisk beside Ontario, and I quickly tried to read it.
Like, what?
Did it say the environmental stuff doesn't have to be reported?
Okay, so this is an example of, not related to FOI, as a general policy I have in my reporting, if there are two ways that reporting and the outcome of something can go, you could go this way or this way, I always side with the least controversial one, which may sound like a weird thing to do, but I do think it's the right way to approach things, because I don't want to be criticized of torquing anything. When we were filing our audits with ministries, to try to find the average length of time that files were taking, we found that Ontario and Quebec ministries of the environment had astronomically different rates than all of the other ministries. And when, actually, I think in Ontario it made them way longer, and in Quebec it made it way shorter. And it was, I don't know why. And then we called them and asked them, like, do you know why your numbers, and it was dragging up the entire average provincially, like, very dramatically. And they said that it's because when lawyers or developers are doing kind of due diligence research on specific properties, they have to file requests, and they were either just like really gumming up the system or speeding it along, and it wasn't a true representation of what the average request would be. So we were trying to decide, like, do we include it, do we not include it, do we remove these, or anyway, we included both. So the slides have Ontario with environment files and Ontario without environment files. But good catch. I appreciate you noticing that little
Thank you.
star.
Can we get a mic down in front?
Yeah, sorry. So from what you're saying, like, this shouldn't be happening, like, according to UN convention and everything. But it seems to be, like, on the blame of both the government, but also kind of like a complacency issue. Who do you think is, like, more to blame? Like, do you think it's the public and just a sign that we're getting more and more complacent with whatever the government just wants to do? Or do you think it's, like, the government really just neglecting its people and kind of, like, exercising excessive control?
I do think that the public has responsibility for this. I think that we do. We need to, it's not okay to be completely uninformed. I do think it's okay to sometimes not look at headlines for your mental health, but opting out of participating in society is not a good look. But to me, it's mainly on the government and public institutions. We pay them, we pay their salaries, we pay the paper that it's printed on, like the bricks, and it's all ours, guys. Everybody, look around. We own all of this. So we shouldn't have to tell them. They know this. It's a law. It's a passed law. And that's where I think there really needs to be much more accountability for them for breaking the laws. So yeah. Thank you for your question.
There's a hand stage right.
Thank you. I'm wondering if part of the strategy is for more and more stories to come out that can only come out because someone has successfully gotten access through an FOI. And I'm thinking about parents of kids with autism in Ontario who were told with this new system they would get access to services that weren't available to them previously. And there are thousands and thousands of children on wait lists waiting to work their way through the system. And I'm wondering, do you have any advice or any kind of strategies for parents who are quite organized, powerful, to an extent in their efforts? What could they do? What kinds of requests could they make that would help them gain access to information that could be potentially embarrassing to the government?
Well, thank you for that question, because I mean that was a big part of what secretcanada.com is that we are trying to empower the public to use this system. And we've anecdotally heard from FOI departments that they are extremely annoyed. I mean, impressed, but annoyed. Like, you have no idea how many more requests that we're getting. I don't know how many of them are from our files, although in theory we will be able to tell once we do a second audit, because in the wording, it should flag. But for one, go on secretcanada.com. I can tell you autism is a very common request, and just type in autism or autistic, and you can see all the requests that have been filed, so you can piggyback on those requests. But you can also get ideas for types of requests that you can file, which is another thing that we're trying to teach people. We aren't able to collect completed FOIs from every school board in the country, but we can do the big ones in every province, and that'll give you a good idea of what is out there and the types of records that you can ask.
Great, thank you.
And you can also see what's been successful if file has been released or denied.
I think all right, you're headed to one, and then there's also further back.
There was a directive that came down a while back that said all records have to be computerized. You can't have paper records anymore. So what I noticed occasionally was an agency would say, it's too much work to scan in and computerize all our records, so we'll trash the paper records, and that way we can say we don't have any non-computerized records. Is that something that's widespread? Have you seen that as a problem? How frequent is that?
I've never heard of a directive that says computerized. I mean, I don't doubt you. I know that I do get paper records all the time from institutions that I file. They'll have to, if someone takes notes in a notebook, or police files are a really common one. With Unfounded, when I was researching specific cases, I cannot get access to a police person or to a complainant sexual assault file. In the United States, you can, I'll say, which again, maybe you think that's right or wrong. And not all the information, some of it has been redacted, but you can get some. In Canada, you can't get any. But I would have complainants give me the right to file for their requests, or they would, and you can get police notebooks. But what you're bringing up is a legislated duty to document. And certainly we see public institutions trying hard not to document. You know, I have like routine FOIs that I file all the time, and you know, you'll see in an email, why don't you pick up the phone and call me? Like, don't write that down. Or people just throwing things out. That is true. There was a big scandal in BC from institutions deleting emails, like in the sent folder, in the trash box, like in the triple delete, trying to get rid of all evidence. It's, again, a major issue. But so is hygiene also. You know, you don't need 10,000 emails in your inbox that are innocuous. You got to save the important stuff. And again, this comes down to culture. Are you viewing FOI as a burden, or are you seeing it as like this beautiful symbol of our democracy that you want to help?
All right, 1, 2, 3.
Do you want to yell? I think it's
I
you.
was going to try, but I thought, you know
Oh,
what?
it's over here. Hello.
Let me not use my governmental voice. I'm inside. Thank you for exposing and talking about these different issues so passionately. You've been doing this for a while now. And I think that when you think of the Globe and Mail, we just saw the master plan. And that was a play that was done by Crow Nest Theatre. It talked about the idea of technology and sidewalk labs coming to our city and wanted to build this, not a mega city, but a super futuristic city. Kind of like a spa at Ontario Place. I'm curious to know, from your side of things, and from what you saw from your colleagues as well, what kind of threat do we need to be careful about when it comes to our democracy from tech companies specifically, and the way that they position themselves as having the best interest of the public at heart?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point. My answer is going to be unsatisfying in that I think everyone, including political leaders, are very comfortable talking about privacy. There is infinite will to do privacy legislation in this country because the one thing we all agree on is that we hate tech companies. Like, everyone can get behind that. Meta sucks, they have all our data, Twitter sucks, Elon Musk is not, like, there's no downside. Like, no one's saying, please don't. What I find, again, interesting around this issue is we have Canadian culture is to be extremely pro-privacy. Like, we don't think that I, as a journalist, should be able to pull, a political leader's, police files. Right? I can't get those things. I can't easily investigate businesses that people who are in charge of public institutions are involved with to see if they have conflict of interest because of privacy. But at the same time, we post our breakfast and our kids' birthdays and like our trip to various places, like where it's all out on social media, and it's so frustrating to have that kind of that tension, I guess.
I think there was one question in the middle of the room, and that's going to be our last one.
As to the causal factors, did you find any evidence that the degree of secrecy varied dependent upon the political party in government or other factors?
It's a hard question to answer because, I mean, it's often not centralized, right? It's like individual ministries all have different, and which is a big problem. There's different cultures within each ministry. So a very common complaint we hear, which I've experienced myself, one ministry will release a document, one ministry will not. It's the exact same document. And it's because our legislation has a lot of discretion. But the other thing I really want to mention is, again, the ministries and departments are the best. Where you really encounter it is like small towns are also subject to FOI. They don't have FOI staff. They don't know what the hell you're talking about. They're like, I don't want to give you this. Like, well, you have to because of this. I'm like, well, no. And it's that kind of, I don't want to say lack of professionalism because I'm not slagging them, but they don't have the same understanding of the laws or expertise in-house. So it does really vary by the size of institution, I think for sure. And then the types of government, I think it's across the board that unless you're about to be in opposition, that it's protect yourself. And I do also want to say that a lot of the FOI coordinators, like the front line that you're working with as a journalist, like they get it, they believe in it, but what do you do if your boss, like we heard many stories of someone flagging something for release and then it has to go up a chain to be approved, and well, the minister's office is asking if this could be covered in this type of thing. And again, that might not even be that the politician has said don't release it. It's just an inherent culture of watch your back. That's like, well, I think this might be embarrassing. Like, do we have to do it? No, it's a discretionary exemption. Well, just hold it back, see what they do. And worst case scenario, it gets released in 2 years when a different party is in power, and who really cares? I'm extremely cynical about this, by the way, in case that hasn't totally come across.
Kyle, I think you're up.
Hello, everybody. I am here to give some closing remarks. I know this was, as Robyn mentioned, not necessarily the most interesting topic, but I think you did an excellent job making it interesting for everybody here tonight on this lovely Thursday evening. I know myself, I latched onto a couple of key things, specifically how our system is so much worse than the United States is, which is abysmal if you ask me, because as a proud Canadian citizen myself, I always brag about how much I like our political system much more than the Americans, especially to my American friends on campus. And in this regard, I cannot do that, which is very unfortunate. And also, I was quite shocked at how expensive Freedom of Information Act requests can get, because free is right in the name. So I found that quite intriguing as well. I know when I saw that this was going to be the topic and who the speaker was going to be for this Harold Innis Lecture, I was quite intrigued. I'm a student completing a political science minor, so this is kind of right up my alley. And I also thank my lucky stars every day. I have a free Globe and Mail subscription through Rotman Commerce, shout out. So I've seen a couple of your stories already, and so I was really excited for this talk, and it did not disappoint. I know a lot of people here probably feel the same way. So on behalf of everybody here tonight, everybody watching online, and especially on behalf of the Harold Innis Foundation, I would like to thank you, Robyn, for coming, and Hamutal as well for conducting our excellent Q&A session tonight.
Thank you.